This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us once again one of the most erudite, stars in the celestial sky, Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Always glad to be here.
Once again, I regret your absence in the political scene, but
that makes one of us.
But it's not too late. It's not too late. Well, we've had a lot of stimulating conversations in the past, and we spoke recently about the Supreme Court and gambling, and the idea that, we're going to let that take place, sports gambling, if the state so wishes to be. And this brings us into the concept that many times different governmental agencies have restricted sort of many different kinds of rights and privileges that might be considered in some ways victimless, or at least some impingements on individual freedoms, with the idea that the exercise of those individual freedoms in some ways damages the state or damages the majority of people. And that's been a rather complicated way that our system has worked, has it not?
Yes. What we're talking about here is something that's usually referred to as the police power or the state police power. And by that, I don't mean necessarily criminal law enforcement. It simply means that the state government in our constitutional system has a generally recognized power to pass laws to protect public health, public safety, public welfare, and yes, public morals, which is of course a very big hot button issue in our rapidly diversifying society. But this is something that the state governments, and therefore by derivation local governments, county governments, administrative authorities that are established by the states, all have the power to do unless somehow restricted by state law or by the state constitution. Whereas the national government does not have that same kind of police power, although it keeps trying to find a way to get it.
Well, just to go into this, I mean, it seems to me we could discuss different ways that communities and states, and indeed the national government, have put restrictions on behavior in place. Maybe we could talk about prohibition a bit. The idea is, well, you're drinking, that's bad, that's evil, and in many cases it has been. And different states, as I understand it, passed prohibition laws. Different communities, and they would, besides just general restrictions, they also prevented when alcohol could or could not be sold. And as far as I know, thinking about the legal arrangements that occurred, there was the federal government or the courts did not overturn this. They didn't say, well, you're restricting the rights to have a beer on Sunday. That's your privilege to do that. You're not going to hurt anyone. You go out to dinner and have a glass of wine after church on Sunday. And I mean, maybe you could even say, well, the different religions certainly don't discourage this, and it seems to be very acceptable as health is not violated. But the different governmental entities restricted that and continue to restrict it. But the federal courts seem to allow that to take place. Is there a problem with that?
Well, I don't know what you mean by problem. Moral problem, constitutional problem. I could argue that in the day of the blue laws, for instance, if shops had to be closed on Sundays or if alcohol could not be closed on Sundays, I could try to make an argument that that would be an establishment of religion. And once again, the state has very broad police powers within its borders and over its citizens, as long as it does not transgress some area of the federal constitution. And in that case, if I were trying to get those blue laws overturned or trying to be able to order a drink on Sundays, I would go to the federal Constitution and say that this is an establishment, because Sunday, why pick out Sunday? If they picked out Tuesday, it might be a different matter, but Sunday and its connotations as the day of rest for most Christians would indicate that you've got a religious purpose here behind this law, and it's an establishment. So.
Well, just to go through this, I mean, how that's been parsed out, I guess what I was trying to say is pretty much there was never any terrific debate about putting these restrictions in place, and indeed the federal government, when they added to the Constitution the idea, well, you can't sell alcohol, it's illegal to drink beer in the United States or whatever, that was put in place, with presumably the court saying, well, that's fine. There's putting a constitutional amendment in place that would have sort of, you could say, violating fundamental human rights, if you could say it that way. A fundamental human right is being violated by the Constitution. It's in the Constitution. Would the court say, per se, that this is an illegal constitutional amendment? Would they, or try and chop it up as much as possible?
Yeah, I think when we last met and were talking about some of the language we were using, I don't think that I could say that if you adopt the idea that I talked about in our last show, that rights are essentially, and you like this term, manufactured, then I don't think you can say that something in the Constitution itself is violating rights, because the Constitution is, with this positivist view of things, the Constitution is the ultimate guarantor of rights. If it's in the Constitution, it must be correct.
And the courts would not overturn that. So just to continue on that, so the courts have chopped up the idea of the right to bear arms, if you want to say that. They put several restrictions, different ways. They've tried to chop that up a bit. I mean, it's however you would interpret the initial language, which, the militia, but the courts seem to try and inject, as they look at society and look at the police powers or whatever is out there, they tend to, if I could say it this way, go to their notions of what the common good would be. So the common good is you shouldn't take guns into schools, or we're not. It was an earlier day, but they didn't attempt to, I don't think, do anything about the what is that? The 19th Amendment, whatever the amendment was, that forbidding alcohol. 18th. All right. So they said, oh, the courts seem to, in some ways, restrict issues as the state expands. As the state expands its police powers for the common good, they do sort of run up against with the doctrine of some kind of higher rights that are not explicitly stated, not in the Constitution, but the courts have some kind of a priority responsibility to protect.
Well, this is why I have problems with the concept of fundamental rights. It's an attempt to take a positivist view of the world, that there is no higher authority, there is no higher morality, it's just what's written down or what the people have voted on or declared somehow, and attempting to make some of those rights selectively untouchable, like a natural right. And a lot of times why we pick out this one and we don't pick out that one seems arbitrary. It seems on the basis of what the judge had for breakfast. It seems on the basis of what's being taught at Harvard Law School this year. This is very problematical. But I'll give you a better example, I think, than the Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. Because I think the Second Amendment is sort of easily answerable, because the way the courts have dealt with that is the lawyer's favorite word, reasonable. What is a reasonable restriction on the rights to keep and bear arms? And we can debate that all day, but that's the framework that is used. Let's take a clearly absolutist statement in the Constitution. First Amendment: Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of press. How would you phrase that to make it more absolute? If you were rewriting the First Amendment.
Sounds pretty absolute.
Okay.
It'd be hard to make it, or you could underline that. You could say absolutely under no circumstances verboten, whatever. You could just keep adding. The language is pretty straightforward.
Yes. I mean, how about Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of speech, and we really mean it.
Yes.
We put that in.
Well, you could make it, and if they attempt to do that, it would be punishable by death or something like that.
We could do that. So, well, if that's the case, I think we're agreed that we got pretty absolutist language there. So why is it that there are many different categories of speech that receive no constitutional protection? For instance, fighting words, defamation, and to at least some degree, obscenity.
Well, there's a collision. I mean, I guess what we're getting into is we have a relatively simple document, and the complexities of the world are so extraordinary, and these different, I guess, rights and privileges collide repeatedly, and they're also there's sort of a Bunsen burner under different issues. Some issues are like there's a Bunsen burner under them, and the courts seem to try and cool things out. They turn the Bunsen burner off if they can do it, and I think they possibly see that as their job. Well, I mean, I'm continuing to sort of push a little bit on the state's police power and when they do or don't exercise it and what the courts do about that. And it just seems to me that many actions that this local entities attempt to restrict are in the next location or the next place. Those things are fine, and then the courts, the way they adjudicate this is sort of in a complicated way. I mean, I'm thinking about you could presumably, let's say, miscegenation laws. One member of a race can't marry a member of another race. Different laws against homosexual behavior. I mean, whatever else, drugs, smoking marijuana, laws against that. What about just a host of laws that different entities put in? At the time they're put in, people think this is an appropriate, in their cultural milieu, they think this is an appropriate restraint the state is trying to exercise for moral purposes and the common good, which is that's a very difficult thing to do. And what I'm finally going to mention the word libertarian, and I'll stop right there.
Well, I was going to say, yeah. Well, who gets to make the decision as to what is best for the people or the state or the community? I mean, I think that's where your questions are leading us. Is it the community, or is it 9 people who may be located 3,000 miles away from the community?
Or are these politicians? So in other words, one of the issues out there is the political process is difficult, you could say that. And the whole way that it's created is quite difficult, and the sophistry that's employed, the sort of knavery that often allows people to see the knavery happening. There's the political class there. We made jokes about that earlier, and they know how to manipulate opinion. They go this way, they go that way. Their objective is to stay in office, and they often pass, if given too much power, they do all kinds of things that a neutral observer would say are quite excessive. And is their power excessive to do that? And should the general view of the courts be to restrict that, to restrict the police powers? Should that, that's kind of where I'm sailing the ship a little bit here. Yeah. It's be very restrained about the state exercising police powers to limit behavior, restrained, not perfectly restrained, but restrained.
Yes. Well, and I keep hearing the cynic emerge, and part of me is very sympathetic to that. I think you do have to draw a distinction between the judge who really is attempting to follow precedent and attempting to, what I would simply call, be principled, and a judge who is whose only principle is to do what he thinks best, regardless of whatever the command of the law is. And sometimes I think for somebody with no legal training at all, it can be hard to discern the difference. I think there is indeed a difference. An example that I've talked about before, the idea of treating property restrictions differently from restrictions on personal liberty. there's a very long history of that, going back at least 80 or 90 years, and probably much longer than that. But we could go farther and ask, well, how does property differ from individual liberties? And we could have a huge philosophical conversation on that. So the point I'm trying to make is that I think that you can show a principled difference between restrictions on property and restrictions on individual liberties. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but you can see a basic difference.
But many people would say that individual liberty flows from property. That if you have no property, you're sort of, in some ways, your liberty is quite restrained about what you can and cannot do, and the power of external entities, whatever they are, to direct your behavior is substantially increased. So if I think people could say, and I mean, you could take this back to the liberating impact of property. And in the 18th century, whatever the Whigs, whatever the balances that property gives to resist the state. So there's a lot of, I think a lot of liberty does flow from property, but where the collision occurs is that it also empowers people. Property gives one individual liberty, but in some ways its presence takes liberty away from other people. So if you...
But I think I could do a chicken or egg with you there. I think that liberty leads to property. For instance, if I've got nothing except my labor, then I want to be able to use as much of that labor as possible to invest and increase my wealth and increase my property. And if the state passes a law saying I can only work 8 hours a day when I want to work 16 hours a day, so I think we've got a chicken or egg problem.
We've got a difficult problem, and you could also say that inheritance throws itself in there. And who's the guy, Piketty, whatever the guy is, the French, he's a French economist who wrote a big book about the inequality in the world, and he makes the case that, particularly in European countries, an enormous amount of wealth is inherited. I think he says in some countries maybe 50% of the wealth that exists has just been passed from one generation to the next. So in a way, if you're doing this and you're going to pass your wealth along, the next players at the table are not being fairly treated. Why should one person not have to worry about anything the next person might, and the person that has this great cornucopia of wealth can in some ways impinge on the liberty of other people. It gets complicated, doesn't it? So you could say, well, I want you to work in my factory, and when you work, you have to have a job, and when you come in there, you have to genuflect to the east or something. I'll have some kind of, it'll be an unpleasant experience, and indeed work is in some ways, you could make the case one way or another about that, but the idea of having to earn money to eat bread imposes some sense of restraint and absence of liberty. So you could say the fact that you have to eat something, you have to work to get some food, means your liberty is less.
Yes. Or on the other hand, once again, flipping it, the fact that you are able to turn your labor into food shows the importance of individual liberties. That's where it all comes from. Because what is property but stored up labor?
Well, let's see. That's the 17th. I'm trying to. Is that a Lockean thing? Wherever that came from. Did I get Locke? I don't know. Whoever it came.
Yeah,
I think Locke thought about that. That's at least one.
If he didn't actually say it, he certainly
came
congruent
very
with
close
it.
to it about the debate over property. Well, I won't get too much into this, but the whole notion of liberty presupposes the existence of free will, and it gets rather philosophically difficult there. And do you have the liberty not to breathe or not breathe? Do you have the liberty to see or not see? What about to eat or not eat? And the brain imposes enormous restraints on human behavior. I mean, it's just there, and it's very complicated as to what is truly free and not free. And moreover, which I'm getting back to police powers. I'm circling back in a very surreptitious way. You get into the idea of liberty and actually libertine. So in some ways, the origin of the word is that if you're too free, you can sin, so to speak. And the state is attempting, we're getting back to our police power, they're attempting to impose some secular barrier to liberty. They don't like, I mean, we made, well, the country is free, and really what the state is doing in some ways with the connivance of the courts is checking human behavior in many ways, and the checks that were there in earlier days are being removed, and new checks are being put in place, I would say that. And limits on free speech, offensive behavior, telling jokes, just the general, I guess, climate in the country is in many ways less free. You could say it's less offensive, possibly, but is it? You could not tell a coarse joke in public. I guess you could say that, or it'd be restraints to be some punishment. You might be
social ostracism. I'm not sure that's
well. I don't know. I think
legal.
the state. Well, aren't the courts pushing their dialogue in that direction? You have a hostile workplace, hostile environment, and people are being summarily executed for that. I mean, and I think possibly sued. I think there are civil actions that the courts are saying, well, that's okay. And in some states, some entities, I think, are giving legal color to this issue about telling coarse jokes in a public place, which is a restraint of liberty, and it could be a reasonable restraint, the same way that people might have said at another time, well, laws against miscegenation are reasonable restraint, and the courts just decide what behavior they will or will not permit, and the society does too. We're going to constantly try and restrain liberty, and maybe more so now than earlier. In a more complicated world, we're all sort of jammed together, and maybe they can't be as free if you live in New York City.
I think probably the analytical model I would use is that the idea of what is reasonable changes over time from generation to community. And I would say that there is an objective element to it and a subjective element. And the objective element would be just basic laws of logic. For instance, you cannot have the law of non-contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A simultaneously. I don't know about you, my mind, I don't think could work in a universe where that is not the case. I mean, that's always going to be the case. You can ignore it, you can pay no attention to it, but it's still the case. But then you've got the subjective, community standards. What are we drawing on? What will people think if I say this? And that can and does change over time. Should it? I don't know.
Well,
Yes.
I have some bad news for you, Bucky. You do live in the universe where the irrational things exist. We have quantum mechanics. We have things that, a particle can be in the same place at the same time. One particle can do this and do that. So I don't want to be too jokey about it.
Well, not really, because I live, in my frame of reference, Sir Isaac Newton works 100% of the time, even though I intellectually acknowledge we do not live in a Newtonian universe.
What we're really talking about is, if you can imagine the ocean, and you have deep water and you have superficial water. We're at this level,
yes.
So we sort of stay in a quote, pretend rational universe.
Yes.
Now, what I'm going to do now is to sort of challenge rationality, the charade of rational thinking in the law world, legal world. I keep jousting a little bit with our lawyer colleagues here, but you have deductive reasoning that's going on here. So you have deductive. You mentioned it can be, you use that example. And so if you have a mathematical arrangement, you have things that are 1, 2, 3, seemingly the law attempts to do that. And the story is, the irrational part of the world, the inductive thing that's happening about what does and doesn't appear makes things far more complicated. The important thing would appear to be that the society, or all our fellow humans, imagine, it's like the Wizard of Oz, that if you go into the courtroom or you go wherever, the process, the whole apparatus is there to exalt justice, whatever comes out of that sausage grinder, is going to be the the truth, and but it doesn't seem to always hatch out that way. And trying to put a system in place that will promote that is quite complicated, isn't it?
Well, I think the problem is that the court has notable several self-inflicted wounds when it has tried to serve as the great sage of America and do what is right. And in doing that, it is, to continue with your Wizard of Oz analogy, it has ripped the curtain away and shown the man behind the curtain and left people tremendously upset at it. So by lowering themselves to the level of just regular politicians, the court has done a deep disservice to the law. They've done a deep disservice to the institution of the Supreme Court, and I don't see that coming back anytime soon.
It's a very complicated story, isn't it? If you don't think you can really get justice, no matter how noble your cause is, that causes all kinds of problems, doesn't it?
Yes, I don't know if you've read much of Edgar Lee Masters.
Tarzan, is that Tarzan?
No, that's Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Lee Masters, Spoon River.
Oh, is he a poet?
Yes.
He's a poet.
You remember Spoon River? Yes.
He's in Indiana. He's in Indiana. It takes
but,
a heap of living to make a house at home. I don't know if I got that right. Is that alone?
But his view.
So it's not Tarzan. Okay,
yes,
I missed that one.
No. But I think you and Edgar Lee Masters are blood brothers, because he once wrote a poem that if you take the blindfold away from Lady Justice there in front of the Supreme Court, you see these bleeding, horrible eyes and sores. That it's not. So. You're very cynical about the law, and if you approach it from sort of a quantum viewpoint, then perhaps that's the way you have to be.
Well, I don't want to be too mean about it. I mean, many times I'm just it's the cultural war that fights its way into the courts. Okay, the complexities of trying to make the world work here with all the change going on. I don't belittle the task that the justice system has. I mean, it's certainly very, very difficult. I don't know how it could be improved. You mentioned the judges. Should judges be paid more money, and should they have enforced retirement at a particular age? Maybe they do that in some degree. Do they? Judges, the Supreme Court seems to stick around forever. But can you? I think there's at least some ideas that are to take senior status.
Yes. The Judicial Conference, I think, has rules about senior judges, but you can't force them off the bench entirely. That's another issue. But my big issue is not whether or not they're getting old and decrepit, but whether or not they're just being too political.
Yes.
And once again, I'm sympathetic. I think judges tend to be much too activist in this day and age, but what can you do?
Well, it's a tough job. It's extremely tough, and it's trying to keep our species at peace with one another, isn't it? It's always been very daunting, all the contrary opinions that are out there. Well, Bucky, we've had a great conversation. We look forward to talking to you some more, and we'll do that. Okay, thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.